Welcome back to the Oxford University Scientific Society in week 5 of Trinity Term. Having taken a break for a week, today we resume with an interview with Dr. Irina Higgins from DeepMind. Irina is also an Oxford alumna, having completed a DPhil here on computational neuroscience. In the next hour, apart from talking about DeepMind and artificial intelligence, we'll also be touching upon careers-related topics. I'll be hosting this interview alongside our Vice President Carlos. As per usual, please type your questions in the comment section and we'll try to integrate them within the interview.
Okay, so if you don't mind, I will start. So hello, Irina. Very nice to meet you and welcome to Oxford University Scientific Society.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
It's truly a pleasure to host you today. And I think we're just going to start with the basics. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and a brief introduction to what you're doing currently at DeepMind?
So I've been at DeepMind as a research scientist for almost 6 years. This was my first job after PhD at Oxford. So my PhD was in computational neuroscience. My undergrad background is in psychology. So you might wonder, how did I end up in AI? I think I've always actually had a strong interest in the mathematical side of things. So I really enjoyed maths at school. So actually, when I went to university in my psychology degree, I think literally on the first day we were told, please, you can rejoice, there will be no maths in this degree. It was actually quite scary and disappointing. So essentially, after my degree, I tried to kind of claw my way back to something more computational and more something quantitative. So my PhD was in computational neuroscience, which was trying to essentially build spiky neural network models of the auditory brain. And then, so during the PhD, I was wondering what career to take. I tried a bunch of things. I thought about consulting, tried a bunch of internships in finance, and in the end, a friend suggested that I try tech. And I never really thought of myself as a tech person, even though obviously I needed coding for my PhD and actually coded in part-time kind of jobs. I was a web developer just for fun. So I kind of knew how to do it, but I didn't think that it was enough. I never studied computer science. But I did apply to Google and passed the interviews. And next thing I knew, I was doing an internship at Google Research, back to back with internship at Goldman Sachs in their quant team. And it was kind of a, very striking contrast. And I guess kind of a nice way to make a decision about my future career. So Google, to me, felt like more my kind of place. And they had just acquired DeepMind, so they asked if I would be interested in interviewing with them. And apparently DeepMind was the best fit I could ever think of, given that I have interest in neuroscience and AI, and kind of essentially every interest that I had. So I first joined in the neuroscience team. Now I've changed teams to what we call frontiers. Essentially, it's like a bunch of mathematicians, physicists, and neuroscientists. And my research is on unsupervised representation learning. So essentially thinking about what does the brain do to learn better representations of sensory stimuli, like vision or auditory inputs. Why does any processing need to happen? Why is it not okay just to pass, for example, just retinal images further on? And if the brain is doing something to it, can we replicate that in algorithms and then give it to artificial agents so that they can solve human-level tasks more efficiently?
Right, wow, that's a very long introduction. I think we'll probably dissect that a bit more in the next hour to come. But just to start from the very beginning, so you mentioned that you started off as a cognitive psychologist, or your background was in psychology. So what actually inspired you to do that, in the first place?
To be honest, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I did code with my brother even in high school, and he was, very much set on going to computer science. And actually, he was the first one who went to Oxford doing computer science.
Right.
I, for some reason, did not connect any of the fun coding that we're doing together with the computer science degree. To me, computer science was more about the hardware or like, the big O's. I didn't necessarily think that that's what I want to do with my life. So my other passion was biology, and I actually thought about becoming a doctor or like a surgeon. But at the same time, for some reason, my family did not like the idea. So they they were a little bit old-fashioned at the time, and I guess they considered that as a woman, I should, I don't know, spend less time studying and maybe more time thinking about having a family, which is obviously very old-fashioned right now. But I didn't know any better at the time, and psychology was kind of presented as a better alternative because you don't have to study for as long, and you have better work-life balance afterwards. So essentially, I ended up applying for a psychology degree, not really knowing what it would be about or what I would get out of it. And I very quickly understood that it wasn't actually something I enjoyed that much. It was great in many ways, but I preferred the neuroscience module, which was obviously just one module among many, and I did miss the kind of like the quantitative aspect of it. So that's why I decided to look elsewhere for my PhD.
Right. Have you ever thought about like being a research scientist? It would be something you wanted to do, whether it be at psychology or neuroscience or any other professions you wanted to pursue?
Again, so science wasn't really on my radar at all. I guess I come from a quite small village in Russia, so I don't have any example like role models who were scientists. I didn't obviously I knew that science existed, but it was just like never an option. So no, I thought essentially I would get my degree and get a job, potentially working like a psychologist in a business somewhere.
Right. That's probably quite different from where you actually ended up then. So I was wondering, like, did you explore any other options, as you mentioned earlier, apart from psychology, apart from what you're currently working in? Anything else that caught your eye on the way, or?
So for me, as I said, I knew I didn't, after I started my degree, psychology wasn't for me. So then I knew I had to do kind of another step of education. And essentially, I was kind of like doing greedy optimization at every point. So, there was an opportunity during my second year to take a kind of almost a gap year from my degree and go and work somewhere. So it was kind of a program that my university organized. So, and you could essentially pick from the options that they offered, or you could find your own. And given that my brother was already at Oxford and he had this second year, living out of college thing, I thought, well, wouldn't it be great if we lived together? And if,
well, some people might disagree with you on that, but
so essentially, I kind of I looked through the lab names at Oxford and found a lab called Oxford Center for Computational Neuroscience and Artificial Intelligence, which just sounded very cool to me. And I thought, I'll just reach out and see what happens. And of course, the first email I got kind of resound no, we don't take undergrads. This is kind of not something that's going to happen. But I kind of tried to explain that maybe you will reconsider. Maybe I'm a kind of special case. I can maybe I can talk and prove something to you. So the supervisor, Simon Stringer, was actually really nice, and he actually did give me a chance. He invited me for an interview, and evidently, I did something right. So he invited me to come for that second year. And once I've spent the year with the lab, actually ended up writing a paper based on the research that I was involved in. Simon suggested I stay for my third year project with the lab that also resulted in a paper. So then I was like, well, it kind of seems like PhD is natural from here. So I applied to stay with the lab for PhD, and that was it.
Within
Sorry, your question was about options.
Within the same research group?
Yes, essentially I stayed with the same group for my PhD, but I kind of changed topics. And then when I started my PhD, now the question was like, do I want to stay in academia or do I want to do something else? Obviously, academia was an option, like kind of a natural next step, but I wanted to see what else was out there. So I kind of like did some research, which jobs actually, benefit from having a quantitative PhD. And it seemed like quant jobs in finance was something that actually required a PhD. So I started applying to internships, and as I said, like I did actually 3. So I did Deutsche Bank first, then a small asset management company, and then Goldman. So I felt like I've experienced quite a spectrum there, and it was great. I loved my first internship, but then after the second and third, I found that maybe like I essentially ended up doing the same project over and over again because it worked in the first place, and they kind of once they learned about it, they wanted to repeat it, and then it became just like moving between different groups and doing the same thing for them. And just didn't feel like I would be learning that much or kind of would have opportunity to improve like my machine learning skills or like math skills or anything like that. Whereas at Google, it felt almost the other way around. Like I arrived and it was all about just take every learning opportunity you can. The internship project is great, but like don't obsess about it. Actually, have fun, talk to people. So this is why I thought that it seemed more of a more opportunity for growth then.
Right.
Actually, you mind if I ask a question? So from the outside, it feels like you've been sort of switching fields all along the way, right? Like you started with psychology, you moved into more sort of quantitative computational neuroscience, did a few actually almost a year, right, in finance, trying things that are like quite different from the sort of things you do in computational neuroscience, and then you moved on to DeepMind. So how have you managed to go from field to field so quickly and in so many cases? What have you learned from that? Was it difficult?
It was difficult, yeah, I wouldn't lie, especially coming to computational neuroscience from quite a few years. Well, I think it was 2 or 3 years, having like not touched math at all. I've realized that I'd forgotten like literally everything. So for quite a few years, my life was about self-studying, like literally. I think MOOCs and like all this like Khan Academy was just starting at the time, so I would load up on lectures there and like go to the library, try to kind of do some like mini projects, kind of like hobby projects on my own and learn through that with friends. So for example, my lab mate and I, we decided to build a poker AI. So that was literally just to learn some like machine learning basics. So yeah, it was kind of like a fun project to do. And actually I learned enough machine learning through that to then apply it in finance.
It sounds like quite a difficult project to start, making a poker playing AI. That's quite impressive.
Well, to be honest, it was mostly about data collection and having a lot of hours online playing.
Do you reckon that, because you mentioned that you actually started coding really early on and your brother was already quite proficient in using programming languages, do you reckon that really helped you in the beginning, or would it have been equally as easy if you had just someone who was completely new to the subject just kind of picked it up in their DPhil?
I think it definitely helped. I think I essentially through just watching my brother in the early days and then like slowly picking up myself, I learned how to think programmatically. And I think once you learn that, then like picking up a new language doesn't take any time. You can literally just Google the syntax as long as you know what you want to express. So I actually never found coding hard. Or like I can't claim that I'm an excellent engineer. I probably won't be able to optimize the code as well as somebody with much more experience and kind of a relevant degree. But I never struggled to implement something I want to implement.
Actually, I think this is the perfect opportunity to come up with a question from the audience. So Nina Kruklikova, she's asking where you did your first degree and if you feel that background in psychology was actually helpful or harmful to your research and career ambitions? I assume she's probably referring to, well, the fact that you are now doing a highly quantitative work and you had 3 years where you had no math.
So my degree was at Westminster University in London, and it's both helpful and not helpful. So, for example, when I was applying for finance jobs, people were asking like, why finance, given your background? Even when I was doing, even when I was applying for my PhD, people were asking like, well, it's very computational. Where's your evidence that you actually can do this kind of work? But at the same time, in my current job, it's actually very helpful because, obviously building AGI is hard. We don't know how to do it, and it's very like ill-constrained. So what we end up doing is kind of trying to bring inspiration from all sorts of places. And obviously humans are the only working example of general intelligence that we kind of want to replicate. So kind of thinking about what makes humans tick, like thinking about developmental psychology, like how do babies acquire better intelligence, or kind of cognitive science, or kind of at a high level, how do humans behave? Obviously, neuroscience comes in. So yeah, I think this kind of background makes you think maybe a little bit differently from somebody who is like hardcore computer scientist or mathematician, which is just very complementary.
What do you think? Oh, yeah, fair enough.
Go ahead, Luna.
What do you think about like having such a like multidisciplinary aspects in your career? Is something that's typical of people from that you work with, or is it something that everyone somehow learns to pick up on the way?
It's a good question. At DeepMind, I think it's kind of a special and unique environment.
Mm-hmm.
So Demis Hassabis is himself kind of a polymath. Obviously, he did his PhD in neuroscience. He's like chess, games, prodigy, and like he's good at everything. And I think when he was assembling the team, kind of like multidisciplinarity was important to him. So as I said, we have a dedicated neuroscience team with a lot of people kind of with similar backgrounds to me. Frontiers team is like this melting pot of literally like, as I said, like any kind of background, mathematicians, physicists. We have like computational biologists, like all sorts of backgrounds. We are trying to kind of ever increase that diversity because it feels like it's super important for what we do. And I found even in my personal job, for example, I don't have background in physics, but as my research evolved, I actually realized that I needed to understand physics because it constrains the evolution of intelligence and kind of the nature of tasks that intelligence has to solve. So if I want to think about like what inductive biases to put in the models, like how to structure them, how to shape them, I really need to understand physics. Like at DeepMind, you have a lot of physicists, so you can kind of get pointers and learn much faster than you would on your own. But yeah, I kind of spent last year learning the relevant parts of physics and trying to integrate it in my work.
Okay, so it sounds like a great opportunity to start talking a little bit more about DeepMind. So when you joined DeepMind, was it 6 years ago, if I am correct, like around 2015? So it was a smaller company than it is today. So how was it, and how has it changed since you joined?
So when I joined, I was like employee 118, I think. It was pretty tiny. I remember we had a small office and it still wasn't kind of fully occupied, and you knew everyone. We would have monthly socials with the whole company, so it felt very much like a family. Now we're like, I would say, around 1,000 people. So obviously a very, very different dynamic. And it was interesting to kind of like be there as the company grew and as the dynamic changed. I would say there were some moments when, we had growth pains where, when it's 100 people, you can literally go, like, okay, this person knows this question, like the answer to this question, just go and ask. Whereas now it kind of becomes harder. You have to like put processes in place. You have to actually like systematize things. So I would say it doesn't, like, obviously it doesn't feel the same, but somehow they did manage to keep maybe like the core of the culture intact. So it still feels like incredibly friendly, and like literally anyone you talk to is your immediate friend. And yeah, it's very stimulating, academically, and in terms of like you have all these amazing people interested in very similar things to you and working on kind of very related problems. So you always can have an interesting conversation.
So tell us a bit more about the culture. So what's in DeepMind? What is in the culture that like really appeals to you beyond what you have told us, and why? In which sense is it unique? Be different to like other companies that do similar things, or like to the main sort of Google culture that is also like very well similar to what you have described.
Yeah. So I think the main difference for me, even between Google and DeepMind, is Google still feels kind of hierarchical, whereas a DeepMind, you'll have a Friday drinks, and demos will hang out, and literally everyone, if you're an intern or like I don't know, even if you're a guest of another DeepMinder, you're welcome to come and ask questions, and demos will happily talk to you. We also have like a lot of intellectual freedom. Again, at Google, they have quite strict projects like OKRs, they call them, like every 6 months. The team has to deliver. It has to be obviously like related to a product. So you kind of, often you can't really decide exactly what you'll do yourself because you have to prioritize the team's goals. Whereas in all my 6 years at DeepMind, no one has ever told me what to do. It's also very egalitarian. So you can be in the company for a few months. If you have a great idea and you're willing to like talk about it and lead it, and other people are interested in joining, then you become a project lead, and you can have 5-10 people working with you on kind of your idea. So I think these are kind of the main things that intellectual freedom. You have the ability to like take as much time as you want. Like you could take a month off, for example, just to go and read off some physics textbooks, and no one will ask any questions because they know that you'll come back and then you'll write like this great new paper that you wouldn't have written otherwise.
So what do you reckon keeps it all together? I mean, it's all great and good that everyone has the chance to explore whatever areas they wanted, but there ultimately has to be some sort of a purpose or some sort of an output, right?
No, so individually, you're judged on your impact, whether it's internal or external. So external impact could be like in any scientific career, it's how many times you get cited, how many talks you give outside, and, your involvement in the community, the broader scientific community. Internally, it could be like maybe you've written this amazing code base that everyone is relying on, or you've optimized something, or you have developed some sort of algorithm or idea that has changed the thinking of many people. So it doesn't even need to be published at that point. So you're measured on that, and of course, your timelines are your own. So you might take like 9 months off to do some like soul searching and thinking, and then you come back, and in the next 3 months you write a paper, and it's actually changes Dennis's perspective on AGI, right? So obviously that's huge impact, and that will be recognized.
So how does it actually feel to work there? What do you do on a normal day? Like, is there a routine, or does it really depend? Do you mostly write code? Do you mostly think?
Yeah, I think it's like in any academic career, it kind of goes in phases. But maybe like a standard one is you come up with like a broad research idea. You probably do like a lot of literature search and like reading, talking to people, trying to like, figure out, is it a good idea? How should you reframe it and really like specialize? Maybe like during that process, you find people who are also interested, maybe like build a team around it. Then it's all about the execution. So you try to kind of develop this new agent or kind of new theory. Obviously, it takes trial and error until something actually works, and then it's about writing it up. So you race to a conference deadline, or you submit to a journal. You write it, then you go and present. You do like maybe a tour of invited talks. And then you have rinse and repeat. So that was, like, broadly speaking, that would be it.
Sorry, I was muted. So
No worries.
sorry about that. So in particular, I am conscious that, well, DeepMind is quite protective of its IP, but could you perhaps give us a little bit more detail in what you do? You've mentioned unsupervised knowledge representation, but could you give us some details on what specific parts of that field you're working on?
Yeah. So if you think about vision, so I primarily work with vision just because both in neuroscience we know a lot about the visual system, and images are kind of like a very popular domain to work on in AI. So if you think about the visual brain, obviously we kind of get our perception of the world through the retina. And actually, what we know is that that's all the information we'll ever get, right? You can't add information through processing, you can only lose it. So, but we also know that there is a bunch of cortical processing afterwards, where some learning is happening, the representation is kind of getting low dimensional, and the question is, like, what's going on? Like, what's the purpose of it, and what's the output? And kind of a strong hypothesis, both in neuroscience and AI, is that what we want is we want to kind of lose information that's not relevant to the task. So typically the task is seen as like object recognition. So is this a cat or a dog? And maybe things that you're not interested to do this task is like what color is the dog, or where it is, or like, well, what's happening in the background. And that's kind of what a lot of the you may have heard, like, the image classifiers, these like deep neural networks that take an image and then they tell you like what breed of dog it is, or like what object it is, and they actually can do it better than humans now. So this is kind of what was the status quo in machine learning for a very long time. But then you think about it from kind of like artificial agent perspective, where maybe actually the agent needs to solve other kinds of tasks. Like it's embodied, it's in the world, it needs to act, and maybe actually for this agent to survive, it needs to differentiate between different colored dogs, right? Or maybe it needs to know what's happening in the background. And if you just give this agent a visual system that discards all that information that's pre-trained on this classification task, the agent is essentially blind to a lot of these variations, and that's not great. So the question then becomes, like, how can you learn vision that's better for many, many more tasks, not just one? And especially if you don't know what the tasks will be in advance. And this is where kind of my work comes in, and we talk about something called disentanglement, where, broadly speaking, we'll say, well, if you wanted to create a 3D world like ours, how would you do it? You would probably specify, okay, this is going to be like 3 objects. One will be small, kind of maybe blue, and it will be like on the left, the other one will be large, etc. So essentially, even as I'm describing this, there are very few words that describe kind of the basics of the scene. And there are very few properties, like you describe maybe the position, the color, the number of the object, the shape of the object. So the idea is that maybe we can kind of invert this and have a model that looks at a bunch of pictures of 3D scenes and then learns a representation where kind of one dimension in that representation will encode everything to do with the position of an object, another one will encode everything to do with shape and color. And so essentially we disentangle kind of these important properties of objects into different subspaces in the representation. So it's low dimensional, so we'll lose a lot of kind of irrelevant detail. So we don't use as many kind of like dimensions as like the pixel space. But at the same time, we keep the important bits. So then when a task comes, and the task is like, what color is the object, you actually have that information, and it's very readily accessible. So that's kind of my work. So I developed the first algorithm that could do that without any access to the ground truth, so without any supervision, by just like looking at the images. And then later work connected this idea, like, okay, so what are these dimensions? Where do they come from? And why should we, why should the model discover that? We connected that to the idea of symmetries from physics, kind of the idea of transformations which commute with each other, kind of how also kind of in physics symmetries are connected to the idea of conserved quantities. and essentially conserved quantities are like the cores of the world, like the objects, the entities. So in effect, by learning a representation that reflects the symmetries of the world, we also discover kind of the objects and the entities of the world. And these things kind of give us this, essentially, that's what tasks are all about. It's about manipulating the entities in the world.
I see. So I had the intuition that you will be using your sort of psychology understanding of how the brain works to design better networks, but it feels like you're just using the inherent, well, symmetries in the laws of physics to design your things. That's super interesting. So, can you give us an example of how that technology has been used in DeepMind to do other more, well, applied things?
Yeah, so the whole idea was to kind of do this representation learning to make artificial agents more efficient and kind of better generalization. And we've shown that, for example, you can do these very simple tests for artificial agents. For example, you teach it to collect like apples and ignore lemons, right? Apples are good, lemons are bad. And maybe that's kind of, you teach it in a green room, and then you go to a blue room, and in the blue room you have like strawberries and I don't know, limes, right? And now like strawberries are good. And so the agent knows that it has seen both rooms, it has seen both objects, but now you switch the objects around. So now, so apples are in the blue room and strawberries are in the whatever the other room. And you would think that the agent would just, still do the right thing. But actually, the naive agents, which don't have the kind of vision that, my models give it, all that information about the room and the objects is kind of entangled in one big mess in the model. And actually the agent struggles. So now strawberry in a different color room is not the same strawberry as was before. So it doesn't actually know what to do. Whereas with the disentangled vision that my model gives it, it's all in different kind of spaces, subspaces for your representation. So essentially the agent's policy, still works really well. So we show that, this kind of transfer between different environments is significantly better. We've also applied it recently to EEG analysis. So here it's, you just have raw EEG, and you know that some people who this kind of recording is coming from had depression, others didn't. So the question is, can you train some representation from the raw EEG data that will kind of recover the biomarker of depression without knowing who is who? And we show that again, it was able to do that, and it was able to kind of just find this known kind of one known biomarker of depression, and then kind of like we could identify what it was, and it was all very interpretable, and it means that it can actually be used as a tool to discover new biomarkers of kind of other conditions.
Well, that is super interesting. Really, really cool application and technology as well. So I'm conscious of time, so then I'm gonna start. Let's wrap up the topic about DeepMind so we can move on to some of the topics. So I'm gonna ask my last question here, which is we've touched on it a little bit, but I just want to ask it anyway, which is, what do you recognize are the main differences between working in academia, sort of in a public research institution, and working in the private industry as a researcher? And potentially for our speakers, and actually, to be honest, for myself, what factors do you think one should consider between deciding between the two?
So I think there are obviously differences between different scientific fields. So I can only comment really on neuroscience and kind of AI machine learning. So one thing I found with the academia and neuroscience in particular was, the pace of work was quite slow. And also, at least in my experience, it was quite isolating. I found that, you publish in journals, you hardly ever see the other people who work on similar topics. The only feedback you kind of get is if somebody cites you, but if you're in a niche setting, it's not going to happen that often. So essentially, kind of like almost shout into kind of an abyss. Whereas in machine learning, and especially in the academic setting, it's very much more fast-paced. There are 3 conferences, like main machine learning conferences a year, and potentially you could have papers submitted to all 3 of them. I've done that. So essentially kind of like iterate over projects very, very quickly. You get immediate feedback. So DeepMind, obviously, everyone works on kind of like with the same goal in mind. So internally, you get immediate feedback. Externally, also, once you present at the conference, you kind of have a lively poster session. Typically, people will want to chat afterwards or kind of build collaborations. So I just find that in the industry, it's much more lively, much more fast-paced, and maybe much more interactive. Plus, you also get a lot of support that you wouldn't get in academia. Like, at DeepMind, you have scientists, but you also have engineers. You have project and program managers. You have like incredible support from, let's say, like the travel team. So if you want to go to a conference, they'll help you book everything. So sometimes it kind of gets to the ridiculous point where, we get an email saying like, please remember to pack your passport, because people get so kind of like used to everything is being done for them that they even forget these like small details.
Wow, that sounds quite like the dream life here. Is there anything that you think that the academia offers that the industry doesn't?
Again, so DeepMind feels like a special environment because it's very academic, but I know that in other industry scientific labs, you perhaps can get more pressure to kind of do something useful for the company. So kind of more maybe product focus. So maybe you wouldn't get as much research freedom as you would in academia, and maybe not as much. Like obviously, once you have tenure, you have much more security, and you can kind of like go and then investigate, potentially much more open-ended questions, kind of much more ambitious research questions. I feel like this is not actually a differentiation with DeepMind, because, as I said, it is very, you do have all the intellectual freedom you want at DeepMind.
Well, it seems like DeepMind's model is working. Do you think you will ever go to a different job, or currently that's not, you're very happy with the current work-life balance or the kind of tasks you do?
Yeah, no, so I think you always look out for something else and you kind of wonder. But so far, I have not seen any other opportunities, and I can't even think of another opportunity that would make me, essentially, which will match what DeepMind has. Not even talking about giving me something better than what DeepMind is. As I said, like you do have the intellectual freedom and the support, and you can work in. You can take some time off to think, and no one will say anything, or you can come back and work. I don't know. 12-hour days and be super productive, and again, it's your choice, and you can, because you work on the things that actually interest you, it doesn't feel like work.
Right. Have you seen anyone around you that doesn't enjoy the kind of lifestyle, and if so, for what reason?
I think burnout is a thing at DeepMind, but it's not, as I said, like nothing is really forced. So it's just, people get too excited and then kind of maybe work a little bit too hard. And I think, at Oxford, like, the feeling, like sometimes you just want to do a bit more. And I think, I think DeepMind also, I would say, a lot of people are kind of high achievers and very competitive. So there's a bit of this internal feel like, oh, but if I don't do this, then somebody else will probably get ahead, like and have a, I don't know, faster career or whatever, and maybe that puts a little bit more pressure on you.
Right. Well, I think so far we can definitely say that the pros outweighs the cons. So I think we'll probably wrap up the DeepMind section here, Carlos, unless you have anything else to add. No? Okay, we'll probably move on because we do only have 15-20 minutes left. And audience members, please do post questions so you can integrate them in the chat in our interview. Hopefully we won't be able to miss anyone, but let's move on. And this is going to be the last section where we talk about just a general outlook about the industry, about just other things that pick up on some loose threads. What do you see as the next breakthrough or the next few breakthroughs in the tech industry in the coming 10 years?
Okay, 10 years is a long time. And
Sure, 5 years, whatever, in the future.
yeah.
Here, next 6 months.
So okay, 6 months is also a bit short, but I don't know if you're familiar with the big large language models that have been very popular recently, and like GPT-3 and all of that. I think that was kind of one of the biggest qualitative shifts in AI recently, and I think we're still kind of as a field, we're still processing exactly what it means. So I think maybe for the next couple of years, it will probably be kind of like incremental changes in that direction, just kind of making these models more robust and maybe kind of make them do things like other things than just kind of generating kind of cool sounding language, but maybe without that much purpose. So I think giving them more, well, first of all, like making them multimodal. So for example, they can understand images as well as kind of language prompts, making them more stable so that they don't kind of contradict themselves. If you sample kind of many different, kind of ask them questions about the same topic, but often they kind of just, it's essentially what language models are now is like 1,000 people in one. So when you ask it a question, you don't know which person will answer it, and obviously, the different people will have different opinions, so you get kind of like very inconsistent results. So I think making them kind of one person, so that they have the memory of what they've already said and kind of an opinion that they can kind of continuously talk about when they're talking to you. I think that's another important thing. But in terms of what we actually kind of need going forward, I think what we need is something that can like really reason, like the way humans do that. I don't know if you're familiar with like system 1, system 2 distinction. That it comes, well, Daniel Kahneman made it popular in his Thinking Fast and Slow book. But this distinction kind of comes across in many different fields. There's always like one system that's quite intuitive, kind of associative. It's fast. So for example, like it's very much like you give it some input, it immediately produces a response. It's kind of like how maybe animals act, kind of how humans intuitively act. And that's kind of, that's the system that humans actually use the most. But system 2 is something different. It's like this slow, deliberative, conscious kind of processing that requires a lot of resources. So for example, like working memory in humans. And that's something that, it's very expensive to use. So even humans kind of often don't use it, but that's what essentially we need to make like scientific discoveries or kind of think out of the box and kind of create new knowledge. And I think that's something that our algorithms are nowhere near. And I think that's what the original AI was about, kind of this whole symbolic AI, kind of introducing logic to these models. So kind of the dream was there 50 years ago, but essentially it just proved too hard to systematize kind of the world knowledge and kind of like, actually use formal logic over it. So kind of people gave up on that, and then like deep learning came about, and it's like such a great thing to implement this system 1, like the associative fast kind of thinking. The question is now, can we take that technology, deep learning, and try to somehow make it do slower system 2 reasoning as well?
So what do you reckon is the main obstacle then? Is there something that, if conquered, would enable us to do much more or much better?
Well, I think yeah, this kind of reasoning is the obstacle. How to conquer it, I think no one really knows. People are trying kind of using deep learning as a front end to the old-fashioned kind of like symbolic AI. People are trying to do it end to end, but it's a very hard problem, and I think few people work on it right now. But it can be kind of revolutionary and very impactful.
I think I'll probably pick up one of the audience members' questions. Carlos, would you mind reading it out? Because I feel like it's probably more your thing than my thing. So.
Wow, this is a massively specific question, but that's right.
Yeah.
So this is one of the fans of your papers, so the Vita Variation Autoencoded paper. I was asking, what potential do you see in disentanglement beyond interpretability? And then he claims that new work from Google show that it's not as useful for downstream tasks, which you may or may not want to comment.
So I'm not sure what exactly this work is. I know there was a paper from, I think 2 years ago now, from Zurich, from Francesco Locatello. Is that, I don't know if we can interact. But I think that was probably the most, like the biggest splash in that area that kind of show that it's not so useful, but actually then the same group published more papers that show that it is in fact useful. So I think there's enough evidence, there's enough kind of pieces of work that show that it is useful. The question is, essentially in the paper that I'm referring to, they had some issues with how they measured disentanglement and the tasks that they were trying to solve. So I think this is a very specific conversation. So if you want more detailed answer, please send me an email and I'll try to answer that.
Fair enough. We don't often get enthusiastic fans on the audience, but that's refreshing, I guess. Right, we'll continue our previous conversation about just the general outlook about tech. What would you say are some good practices that encourages innovation in science or in whatever specific area you work in?
So
what would be some good practice or some rules or some good environment to encourage innovation?
So that's a good question. I think actually allowing people freedom to take time off and really think deeply about things is important. I find even with my own work, like once you have a few projects rolling, you always have something that you kind of immediate for one of the projects that you need to do. And then it kind of like becomes this race, like you're just juggling many different things. And essentially you end up paying quite little attention to anything in particular. And you make progress, but it's very much surface level. Like you're not using your system chip there, right? You're not doing deep reasoning. So I think sometimes you need this time to like just put everything on hold, take a day, or if you can, maybe in a week or a couple of weeks, and really think about what are you trying to solve, why, read more broadly, kind of expand your horizon, like just have random discussions with your peers. So actually that's one thing that I miss from working in the office, that you don't just, we don't have this random social encounters. You don't just like bump into somebody at the coffee machine and, start talking about something inconsequential and then it turns into some like crazy thought and that becomes like a project. We also used to have team retreats where we would all go away to, some hotel in the countryside for a week. And there'll be a lot of like team bonding experiences, but also brainstorming sessions and just like, again, just natural interactions in a relaxed environment always lead to kind of brainstorms, kind of good ideas. So I think something like that is probably the main thing that, at least for me, helps.
Well, I'm going to just take the opportunity to ask you what I think has to be our last question in terms of timings. And I think this is going to be a very classic question, but still very important for our audience, which is, so if you had to give one piece of advice to everyone here that wants to, or someone here that wants to take a career in technology, be it in a sort of more research branch like you're doing, or a sort of more classical tech career, what would your advice be?
So I think it's kind of hard to give a general piece of advice for everyone because there are different companies with different requirements. But if you want to work somewhere like DeepMind, or even like I would say, any big like AI lab or kind of creative job like that, then I think what we really value is seeing that somebody's actually passionate about these kind of things. People often come and they would say, "Oh, I studied machine learning in my master's," or I don't know, went to this conference. But I think if you actually were interested in this, you probably would have already coded a model because there's so many online resources available. You probably would have created something, even if it's simple, but you would have had your hands dirty by now. So I think having kind of like hobby projects to do with what you actually want to do as your job is super useful, because you have something to demonstrate that you're actually passionate about it. And once you start doing this yourself, where it's like practical experience rather than just theoretical experience, you talk much better about it, and you can always sense in an interview that this person has actually done it themselves. And I guess another piece of advice is, if you can, go to kind of big machine learning conference. There's Neuroscience that's coming up in December, ICML or iClear. So this is kind of a great way to immerse yourself in this world, and just going to poster sessions, talking to people, listening to the keynotes helps you again like understand what's the landscape like, what are the big problems, what are people interested in, and also kind of be able to speak the language better.
Right. I think that's probably going to be the last question, and we'll draw this interview to a close. Irina, thank you ever so much for giving up your time to be here today. I hope our audience have taken away something useful in the last hour. Thank you everyone in the audience as well for being here, as well as all the committee members who managed to put effort into this to make it possible. We look forward to seeing you again this Thursday, where we have invited Mr. Herbert Swanneker from Clifford Chance to talk about the implications of advanced technology in the practice of law. So with that, I think this is going to be the last sentence or a few sentences of this interview. Have a lovely evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me.